The universe was full of intelligent life, and almost all of it was afraid. HFY War stood at the top of the Grand Spire on Shale Prime, watching the sky with her 4 compound eyes as the stars began to disappear one by one behind the shadows of 10,000 warships descending upon her world, like a slow and terrible curtain being drawn across the heavens. She was old, even by Valori standards. Her exoskeleton faded from deep emerald to a tired gray-green, and her wings had not carried her in flight for nearly 20 cycles. But her mind was still sharp, and her heart still burned with the stubborn fire of someone who refused to accept the end of everything she loved. The Vraxith Dominion had come. They always came eventually, moving from system to system like a plague of locusts that devoured not crops but entire civilizations, stripping worlds of their biological resources and leaving behind nothing but ash and silence and empty ruins where songs had once been sung. The Valori were not warriors, and had never pretended to be anything other than what they were, a species of scholars and diplomats and archivists who had spent 10,000 years collecting the stories and histories and art of every civilization they had ever encountered, building the greatest library the galaxy had ever known. None of that mattered to the Vraxith. HFY turned from the window and walked with heavy steps into the communications chamber, where her council waited, their antennae trembling with barely contained terror. And she looked at each of them before she spoke. Have any of them answered? Korath, her youngest advisor, pulled up the response logs on the holographic display, and HFY watched as message after message scrolled past, each one a polite and carefully worded refusal, dressed up in diplomatic language that all said the same thing. The Rathani hegemony expressed deep concern, but could not commit military resources. At this time, the Silfari Confederation offered humanitarian aid in the form of refugee ships, but would not engage the Vraxith directly. The Orvani Collective sent their thoughts and prayers, and wished the Valori the very best in this difficult time. 42 species in the Galactic Concord, and not a single one of them was willing to fight. HFY read every message twice, and then she closed the display and stood in silence, while her council watched her with wide and desperate eyes, waiting for her to say something wise or comforting, or at least something that would make the crushing weight of abandonment feel a little less unbearable. There is one more channel, she said quietly. Korath tilted his head in confusion, and then his antenna went rigid with shock as he realized what she meant. Ambassador, you cannot be serious. Open the human emergency frequency. The room erupted into frantic clicking and buzzing as every member of her council protested at once, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of objections that all boiled down to the same fundamental fear. The humans were unpredictable and dangerous and emotional and violent and short-lived and reckless, and no Concord species had willingly contacted them in over a century for very good reasons. HFY raised one weathered hand, and the room fell silent. Every species we trusted has turned away from us, she said, and her voice was calm, even though her heart was breaking. Every ally we cultivated over 10,000 years of careful diplomacy has decided that our survival is not worth the risk. So I am done being careful, and I am done being dignified, and I am going to call the one species in this galaxy that might actually be crazy enough to help us. She activated the transmission herself, because she did not trust anyone else to do it, and she spoke in the simple and direct trade language that humans preferred. Elaborate courtesies and formal structures that Concord diplomacy demanded. This is Ambassador HFY Vorin of the Valori homeworld Shale Prime. We are under siege by the Vraxith Dominion. 10,000 warships are closing on our planet, and we have no military to defend ourselves. Our allies have refused to help. We are asking anyone who can hear this to please come. We do not have much time. She sent the message, and then she sat down heavily in her chair, and closed all four of her eyes, and waited for silence to be the only answer she received. 6 hours away by slipspace, on the cold gray surface of Earth's moon, the message arrived at Lunar Command, like a stone thrown through a window. Admiral Jonah Marin was in his quarters when the alert came through, sitting alone in the dim light, with a glass of whiskey in his hand, and a photograph on the table in front of him, showing a young woman with dark curly hair, and her mother's smile. Years now, killed when Vraxith raiders hit the colony on Hadley's Rest, and stripped it bare of every living thing. He listened to the Valori message twice. The first time he listened as a strategist, calculating distances and fleet positions, and supply lines, and odds of survival. The second time he listened as a father who knew exactly what it felt like to watch something precious be taken away while nobody lifted a finger to stop it. He set down his glass and pressed the fleet-wide communication channel, and when he spoke, his voice was rough and tired, but underneath the exhaustion, there was something harder than steel and older than anger. "This is Admiral Marin to all United Human Systems vessels. We have received a distress call from the Valori homeworld. They are facing extinction at the hands of the Vraxith Dominion. The Galactic Concord has refused to intervene. I am not ordering anyone to do anything. I am asking if you can fly and if you can fight. Form up at Rally Point Sigma. We move in 36 hours. He cut the channel and stood up and looked at the photograph one more time. "I could not save you," he whispered to the girl in the picture, "but I can save them." Across human space, the call spread like wildfire, jumping from frequency to frequency and ship to ship, and something extraordinary began to happen. On Mars, 3 battlecruiser groups broke orbit within the hour. On Titan Station, a carrier fleet that had been undergoing repairs launched with half its systems still being welded together by crews who refused to stay behind. On the frontier colonies, militia captains and private security corvettes and armed cargo haulers turned their engines toward Rally Point Sigma without hesitation. On Earth itself, retired officers walked into recruiting stations and said simply, "I heard the call." Nobody ordered them to go. Nobody threatened consequences for staying. They went because someone had asked for help, and because deep in the bones of every human being there lived a stubborn and irrational refusal to let innocent people die alone in the dark. Teshai sat in her chamber on Shale Prime and watched the Vraxith fleet tighten its grip around her world, and she began the slow and painful work of archiving 10,000 years of Valori history into emergency data cores, so that something of her people might survive, even if they did not. She did not expect an answer. She had stopped expecting answers a long time ago. But somewhere in the black between the stars, 4,000 engines were burning hot and bright, and aimed straight at her dying world, crewed by a species that the galaxy had always dismissed as too young and too angry and too foolish to matter. They were coming, and they were bringing everything they had. 3 days had passed since the distress call, and Teshai had stopped sleeping. She stood at the observation window of the Grand Spire, and watched the Vraxith armada hang in the sky above Shale Prime, like a ceiling of black iron, pressing down on everything beneath it. 10,000 warships arranged in concentric rings that slowly and methodically tightened around her world, the way a serpent tightens around its prey, before the final crushing squeeze. The cities below were quiet now, not with peace, but with the heavy silence of a people who had accepted what was coming, and were spending their last hours holding the ones they loved. Valori children pressed close to their parents in underground shelters, while the adults whispered old psalms and told old stories, and tried to pretend that the trembling in their hands was not fear, but simply the cold. In the deep vaults beneath the Grand Spire, Valori archivists worked without rest to compress their civilization's entire cultural legacy into hardened data cores that might survive orbital bombardment. 10,000 years of music and mathematics and philosophy and poetry being packed into containers no larger than a fist, while the people who had created all of it waited to die. Teshai watched all of this and felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a mountain. Korath approached her carefully, his antennae flat against his head, in the posture of one delivering news he wished he did not have to speak. Ambassador, the Vraxith Overmind has sent another ultimatum. They want us to open the planetary shields and surrender the population for processing within 12 hours, or they will begin bombardment. Teshai did not turn from the window. And the Concord. The Rathani are observing from long range. Several other species have positioned sensor arrays at the edge of the system. The diplomatic channels say they are documenting the situation for historical record. They are not documenting, Teshai said, with a bitterness she could no longer hide. They are watching us die, and they want a good view. Somewhere far beyond the range of Valori sensors, the Concord species were indeed watching, and what they saw confirmed everything they already believed about the way the galaxy worked. The strong consumed the weak, and the smart stayed out of the way, and that was simply how things had always been. Admiral Sorhan Keth of the Rathani hegemony stood on the bridge of his flagship and observed the tactical display showing the Vraxith blockade in perfect detail. And he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not taste like ash in his mouth. He had the ships to intervene, 3,000 of the finest warships in the Concord, but his government had ordered him to hold position and observe, and under no circumstances engage the Vraxith, because the Rathani had spent 600 years building their empire. Through careful calculation, and they were not about to risk it for a species of librarians who could not fight their own battles. Keth obeyed his orders and hated himself for it. On the Vraxith command ship, Overmind Scythak processed the tactical data with cold biological efficiency, its massive neural cluster humming with satisfaction as it calculated the optimal harvesting sequence for the Valori population. The Valori were rich in genetic diversity, and their neural tissue would fuel Vraxith bioforges for decades, and there was no one coming to stop the harvest, because no one ever came. That was the lesson the Vraxith had learned across 1,000 conquered worlds, and it had never once been proven wrong. Then the sensors screamed. Scythak's attention snapped to the edge of the system, where space itself was tearing open in wounds of blue-white light. Not one rupture, or two, or even a dozen, but hundreds of slip-space exits, ripping through the fabric of reality, in a cascade so massive and so violent that the gravitational sensors across the entire system went temporarily blind. When the sensors cleared, the Vraxith saw them. Ships, human ships, pouring out of slipspace in wave after wave after wave, like an ocean breaking through a dam. First came the warships, massive dreadnoughts bristling with railguns and missile batteries, sleek battlecruisers running in tight formation, carriers disgorging swarms of fighter craft the moment they exited slipspace, destroyer packs moving in wolf-like clusters of 8 and 12. Then came the rest of them, and this was what made the Vraxith pause. Behind the military vessels came ships that had no business being in a war zone, converted mining haulers with armor plates welded to their hulls, and industrial lasers repurposed as weapons, colony defense frigates held together with emergency patches and determination, private yachts and merchant vessels and passenger liners that had emptied their cargo bays and filled them with ammunition and medical supplies, and volunteer crews who had never fired a weapon in anger, but had come anyway because someone had asked for help. 4,217 ships in total, and they were still arriving. Teshai's communications officer turned to her, with an expression that her species reserved for moments that broke the boundaries of what the mind could process. "Ambassador, we are receiving a transmission on the human emergency frequency." "Put it through." Admiral Jonah Marin's voice filled the chamber, rough and steady, and carrying the weight of a man who had crossed the stars, not because he had been ordered to, but because he could not live with himself if he stayed behind. "This is Admiral Jonah Marin of the United Human Systems addressing the Vraxith fleet in orbit of Shael Prime. You are engaged in the unlawful siege of a sovereign world and the threatened genocide of a peaceful species. You have 1 standard hour to withdraw your forces from this system. After that, we start shooting. There will be no second warning." The transmission ended, and Teshai stood completely still, as the tears she had been holding back for 3 days finally broke free and rolled down the faded plates of her face. Korath stared at the sensor readings, showing the impossible wall of human ships, and his voice came out barely above a whisper. "They came. They came," Teshai repeated. On the Vraxith command ship, Overmind Scythak processed this development with something that its species did not officially experience, but that might have been confusion if it had the vocabulary for such a thing. The humans had no treaty with the Valori, no trade agreements, no strategic interest in the system, no political alliance, no historical debt, no rational reason whatsoever to be here, risking their ships and their lives for a species they had never even spoken to before. 3 days ago, Sithak ran the calculation 17 times, and each time the result was the same, that there was no logical framework in which this action made sense. And so, Sithak concluded that the humans were bluffing, because that was the only explanation that fit within the models it understood. It sent a response dismissing the ultimatum and ordering its fleet to maintain the blockade. The hour passed. On the bridge of the dreadnought UHSS Defiance, Admiral Marin stood with his hands clasped behind his back, and looked out at the wall of Vraxith ships ahead of him. And then he looked at the faces of his crew, young faces and old faces, and scared faces and determined faces, people who had families waiting for them back home, and who had come here anyway. He thought of his daughter. He thought of the Valori children in the shelters below. He opened the fleet channel one final time. All ships, weapons free, human ships, surged forward into the teeth of an empire that had never once been challenged, and the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath as the galaxy watched a species it had always underestimated do the one thing that no one had expected. The first 60 seconds of the Battle of Shael Prime rewrote everything the galaxy thought it knew about human warfare. The Vraxith expected the humans to behave the way every other Concord species fought, with careful formations and orderly firing lines, and predictable tactical patterns that could be analyzed and countered within minutes. Instead, the human fleet hit them like a fist made of chaos. Admiral Marin did not issue detailed battle plans, because he knew something that the Vraxith did not, that human captains were at their most dangerous when you gave them a target and got out of their way. The destroyer Wolfpack struck first, 12 ships moving as one in tight predatory formations that sliced into the outer ring of the Vraxith blockade at angles that no tactical manual would have recommended, firing railgun salvos at point-blank range that punched through Vraxith hull plating like needles through cloth, before banking hard and vanishing into the debris field they had just created. Behind them, the battle cruisers hit the gaps, pouring concentrated weapons fire into the openings the destroyers had torn, and widening them into gaping wounds in the Vraxith formation, while the carriers hung back and launched wave after wave of fighter craft that swarmed around the larger Vraxith vessels like angry hornets. The Vraxith had numbers, and they had firepower, and they had the cold mathematical precision of a hive mind that could coordinate 10,000 ships as a single organism. But the humans had something the Vraxith had never encountered before. They had rage. Captain Lena Ose stood on the bridge of the destroyer Furious Purpose and watched the tactical display paint the space around her in the red and orange of weapons fire and explosions. And she felt no fear at all, only a burning clarity that narrowed the entire universe down to one simple truth. There were people on that planet below who were going to die if she did not break through the blockade above them, and she was not going to let that happen. "Wolfpack 7, form on me," she ordered, and her voice was calm in the way that a blade is calm. "We are going through the inner ring. Aim for the carrier cluster above the capital city. We break them there, and we open a defensive corridor to the surface." Her tactical officer looked at the display, and then looked at her with eyes that said very clearly that what she was proposing was insane. "Captain, that corridor is defended by at least 80 Vraxith cruisers." "I know. We have 12 ships. I know that too." She opened the Wolfpack channel and every captain answered, and not one of them hesitated, and not one of them suggested an alternative, because they all understood that sometimes the only way forward was straight through the fire. Wolfpack 7 accelerated to attack speed, and dove into the inner ring of the Vraxith blockade, and what followed was 3 minutes of violence so intense that the sensor logs would later be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries. Ose lost 8 ships in those 3 minutes. 8 ships and their crews gone in flashes of light that burned themselves into her memory like brands. The destroyer Ironclad breaking apart under concentrated beam fire. The corvette Relentless taking a direct hit to its reactor and detonating so close to a Vraxith cruiser that it took the enemy ship with it. 6 more vessels burning and dying around her as her wolf pack paid in blood for every kilometer of space they crossed. But they broke through. The Furious Purpose and 3 surviving destroyers punched through the inner ring and opened a corridor above the Valori capital. And behind them, the battle cruisers surged forward to hold the gap, while human fighter squadrons poured through like water through a crack in a dam. On the surface of Shale Prime, Teshai watched the sky fill with fire and light as the battle raged above her world, and a young human liaison officer named Marcus Cole stood beside her, with a communications headset pressed to one ear, relaying updates in a voice that shook only slightly. "Ambassador, the corridor is open. We have defensive coverage over the capital." Teshai looked at this young human who was barely old enough to have lived a single Valori life cycle, and she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the fleet arrived. "Why did you come?" Marcus looked at her with genuine confusion, as if she had asked him why water was wet. "You asked for help," he said. And that was it. That was the entire reason, and Teshai realized in that moment that she had spent her whole life studying alien civilizations without ever truly understanding this one. Above them the battle continued, and the Vraxith were adapting. Overmind Scythak directing its fleet. Efficiency of a mind that felt nothing for its losses and cared only for optimal positioning. And slowly, methodically, the numerical advantage began to tell. Human ships were dying faster than they could be replaced. The converted civilian vessels taking the worst of it, as their improvised armor buckled under sustained fire. And even the military ships were being ground down by the sheer weight of Vraxith numbers, pressing in from every direction. Admiral Marin stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched the casualty reports scroll past, and each number was a ship, and each ship was a crew, and each crew was hundreds of people who had come here because he had asked them to. And he felt the weight of every single one of them. "Admiral, the Vraxith are concentrating fire on our position," his tactical officer reported. "Multiple capital ship signatures converging on the flagship." Sithak had identified the Defiance as the command node and was throwing everything it had at breaking the human leadership, and the dreadnought shuddered as beam after beam struck its shields, and the lights flickered and consoles sparked, and crew members were thrown from their stations. A secondary explosion tore through the port side of the bridge, and a piece of shrapnel caught Marin across the ribs, and he staggered and grabbed the railing and tasted blood, and he did not fall. Damage report. Shields at 12%, Hull breaches on decks 7 through 15, port weapons array offline. Reroute power from life support on evacuated decks to the starboard batteries. Keep firing. He would not leave this bridge, and he would not stop fighting, and if the Defiance was going to die, then she was going to die with her guns blazing and her admiral standing. The human fleet was holding, but it was a razor's edge, and everyone knew it, the line bending under the relentless pressure of an enemy that outnumbered them more than 2 to 1. That felt no pain and no fear and no mercy. Then the sensors lit up again. New slipspace signatures, dozens of them, tearing open behind the Vraxith formation in positions that no human ship could have reached. The communications array crackled with a transmission on the Concord military frequency, and the voice that came through belonged to Admiral Soren Keth of the Rathani hegemony. And it carried the sound of a being who had watched long enough and hated himself enough and finally decided that some things mattered more than orders. Humans, you shame us all. To every Concord vessel receiving this transmission, the Rathani are engaging the Vraxith at Shale Prime. Join us, or live with the cowardice of watching others die for your safety. Rathani fleet, all weapons engage. Behind the Rathani came ships from the Silfari Confederation, who had been sitting on the edge of the system with their refugee transports, and who had apparently been hiding a battle fleet. Behind them the entire time. Behind them came a squadron of Orvani warships, whose government had officially forbidden their deployment, but whose captains had somehow all experienced simultaneous navigation errors that pointed their ships directly at the battle. The galaxy had been watching, and some of them had finally decided that they could not watch anymore. On the bridge of the battered and bleeding Defiance, Admiral Marin saw the new signatures appear on his tactical display, and he closed his eyes for just a moment and let himself breathe. All ships, he said into the fleet channel, and his voice was raw and tired and unbreakable. We are no longer alone. Hold the line. And the line held. The arrival of the Rathani fleet changed the mathematics of the battle in an instant. But it was the combination of human fury and Rathani discipline that turned a desperate defense into something the Vraxith had never experienced in their entire history of conquest. Defeat. Admiral Soren Keth brought 3,000 warships into the fight, and he deployed them with the precision of a species that had been perfecting the art of war for 600 years. His heavy cruisers forming a wall of overlapping fire zones on the Vraxith left flank, while his fast attack frigates swept around to cut off the retreat corridors that Sithak had been keeping open as insurance. The Rathani fought the way they always fought, with cold and measured efficiency. Every shot calculated, every formation exact, every movement part of a larger design that unfolded with the mechanical beauty of a clock. But next to them the humans fought like a storm. And somehow, the storm and the clock worked together. Captain Lena Osei found herself flying formation with a Rathani destroyer squadron, and despite the fact that the two species had never trained together and barely spoke the same tactical language, something clicked into place within the first 5 minutes of joint combat that neither side had expected. The Rathani held the line with iron discipline, and the humans hit whatever the line pushed toward them, and the Vraxith found themselves caught between an anvil that would not move and a hammer that would not stop. Overmind Sithak processed the new tactical reality with something that was not panic, because the Vraxith did not experience panic, but that caused its neural cluster to cycle through calculations at a rate that bordered on overload. For the first time in its existence, the models were failing. Every projection showed diminishing returns. Every tactical adjustment was countered before it could take effect, and the losses were mounting in a way that the hive mind had never been designed to absorb, because it had never needed to, because nothing had ever pushed back this hard. Sithak made a decision that no Vraxith overmind had made in recorded history. It ordered a retreat. The command went out through the hive link, and the Vraxith fleet began to pull back. But retreat was not something they had ever practiced, and the withdrawal was messy and uncoordinated. ships colliding with each other as 10,000 vessels tried to disengage from a battle that had wrapped around them like a net. Admiral Marin saw the moment and seized it. All human ships of Vraxith are breaking. Do not let them regroup. Spearhead formation. We drive straight through their center and split them in half. The human fleet surged forward in a wedge that cut into the heart of the Vraxith formation like a blade through water, and behind them, the Rafani swept in from both flanks and began the systematic work of encirclement that their species had perfected across centuries of warfare. The Vraxith fleet came apart. Ships that had lost contact with the Overmind's direct control began to drift and fire wildly. Their biological crews, unable to function independently after millennia of hive-directed evolution, and whole squadrons went dark as the chain of command shattered link by link. But Sci-Fi itself was still alive and still dangerous, and its command ship was burning hard for the edge of the system, surrounded by a protective screen of its most powerful escorts. And if it escaped, it would rebuild, and it would return, and the next time it came, there would be no mercy, and no negotiation, and no chance of survival for anyone who had stood against it. Osai saw it running. The furious Purpose was barely holding together, her hull scarred with blast marks and punctured in a dozen places, half her weapons offline, her engine output down to 60%, 140 reduced to 93. None of that mattered. Helm, pursuit course on the Vraxith command ship, maximum acceleration. Her first officer turned to her with a look that combined respect and disbelief in roughly equal measure. Captain, we do not have the firepower to take that ship alone. We do not need to take it. We need to slow it down. Signal any ships in range to converge on my position. The furious Purpose leapt forward, and 3 other human destroyers fell in behind her, battered and limping, but still in the fight, and they chased the Vraxith command ship across the system like wolves running down a wounded beast. Sci-Fi's escorts turned to engage, and the running battle that followed was brutal and close range and desperate, ships trading fire at distances so short that the crews could see each other's hull markings. And one by one, Osei's companions took hits and fell away, until only the furious Purpose remained. But she was close enough now. Target their engines. Everything we have left. The furious Purpose fired every weapon she had in a single coordinated barrage that struck the command ship's propulsion array and tore it apart in a cascade of secondary explosions that rippled across the massive vessel's stern and left it drifting and dark and helpless. Sci-Fi's ship was crippled. Within minutes, a Rithani heavy cruiser arrived and locked the command vessel in a tractor field. And then something happened that had never been done before in the long and bloody history of the Vraxith Dominion. Human Marines boarded the flagship. 200 soldiers in powered armor cut their way through the hull with breaching charges and plasma torches, and fought through corridors designed for a species 3 times their size, clearing room after room of Vraxith drones that fought with mindless ferocity, and they kept pushing forward because the mission was simple, and they were not going to stop until it was done. Sergeant Amara Diallo led the team that reached the Overmind's chamber, and when she saw Sci-Fi for the first time, she understood why the galaxy feared the Vraxith, because the Overmind was a massive pulsing biological nightmare of neural tissue and armored chitin that filled an entire room and radiated a psychic pressure that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. She raised her weapon, and the Overmind looked at her through a dozen clustered eyes and spoke through a translator in a voice that was flat and cold and utterly without understanding. Why are you here? You have no connection to the Valori. You gain nothing from this. This action has no logic. Amara stared at the creature that had consumed civilizations and processed billions of living beings into raw material, and could not comprehend why anyone would risk their life for a stranger. And she felt something that was not hatred, but was close to. "That is exactly the problem with you," she said. "You cannot understand it, and that is why you lose." She fired. The Overmind's neural cluster was shattered, and the effect on the remaining Vraxith fleet was immediate and total, like cutting the strings of 10,000 puppets at once, ships going dark and silent across the entire system, as the hive mind that had controlled them for centuries suddenly ceased to exist. The Battle of Shale Prime was over. On the surface of the planet, Teshai stood in the Grand Spire and watched the sky clear as the Vraxith ships went silent, one after another, like candles being blown out. And around her, the Valori communication channels filled with sounds she had not heard in days. Singing. Her people were singing. In the shelters beneath the cities, in the archives beneath the Grand Spire, in the streets where Valori emerged blinking into sunlight they had not expected to see again, voices rose in the old songs that had been carried across 10,000 years and nearly lost in a single terrible week. Teshai listened and wept, and for the first time in her long life, she did not have the words for what she felt, because no word in any language she knew was big enough to hold it. On the bridge of the Defiance, Admiral Marin sat in his command chair, with blood on his uniform and bandages around his ribs, and a tiredness in his bones that went deeper than anything sleep could fix. And his communications officer reported that the last Vraxith ships had surrendered or gone dark, and that the system was secure. He nodded once. "Send to all ships," he said, and his voice was quiet. "Well done. Take care of your wounded. We are not leaving until every survivor is accounted for." Then he leaned back and closed his eyes and allowed himself one moment of something that was not quite peace, but was close enough to let him breathe. 3 months after the Battle of Shale Prime, the galaxy was still trying to understand what had happened and why. And the more it tried to understand, the more it realized that the answer was both simpler and more terrifying than anything it had expected. The footage spread across every communication network in known space within hours of the battle's end. Sensor recordings, and bridge cameras, and personal logs captured by thousands of crews across dozens of species. And the images that burned deepest into the collective memory of the galaxy were not the explosions, or the tactics, or the final boarding of the Vraxith command ship. They were the arrival. The moment when hundreds of slipspace ruptures tore open in the skies above a dying world, and 4,000 human ships came pouring through like a tide that had been held back too long, crewed by people who had crossed the stars for no reason that any rational civilization could explain. Answering, it became the most watched recording in galactic history, and every species that saw it was forced to confront the same uncomfortable question that had haunted Admiral Soran Keth on his bridge while he watched from a safe distance. If the humans could do this for a species they had never met, what did it say about everyone who chose not to? The political consequences were enormous and immediate. The Galactic Concord, which had stood for 2,000 years on the principle that every species looked after its own interests first and cooperated only when cooperation was convenient, found itself in the middle of an existential crisis as its member species turned on each other with accusations of cowardice and moral failure that no amount of diplomatic language could soften. 3 species withdrew from the Concord entirely in protest of its inaction. 7 others demanded a complete restructuring of the alliance. And in the middle of it all, standing quietly at the center of the storm she had created with a single desperate transmission, Teshai Voren presented a proposal that would change everything. She called it the Shale Compact. It was built on a concept so simple that the elder species had somehow never thought to formalize it in 2,000 years of interstellar civilization, a concept that humans carried in their bones the way other species carried instincts for self-preservation or territorial defense. Collective security. An attack on one is an answer from all. No exceptions, no deliberation, no carefully worded refusals dressed in diplomatic courtesy, while innocent people died waiting for help that never came. The debate over the Shale Compact lasted 6 weeks, and it was fierce and ugly and honest in a way that Concord politics had not been in centuries, with species arguing openly about duty and sacrifice and the cost of looking away. And when the final vote came, it passed by a unanimous margin. Margin that surprised everyone, including Teshai herself. 39 of the remaining 42 Concord species signed. Humanity was invited to join, not as a junior member or a provisional ally, but as a founding signatory, with full standing and a permanent seat on the new Security Council. And when the formal invitation was transmitted to Earth, it was accompanied by a personal message from Teshai that read simply, "Thank you for answering when no one else would." Admiral Marin received the news in a hospital bed on Luna, where he was recovering from surgery to repair the damage the shrapnel had done to his ribs, and the damage the battle had done to everything else. And he read the invitation and set it aside, and told his aide that he was honored, but that he was retiring from active service, effective immediately. He had done what he needed to do, and he was tired in a way that no amount of rest could fix, and he wanted to spend whatever time he had left somewhere quiet, where he could hear himself think. But before he left, there was one more thing. Teshai invited him to Shale Prime, and he went, traveling on a civilian transport because he no longer had a flagship to carry him. And when he arrived, the Valori were waiting for him. Not dignitaries and diplomats and officials, although those were there too, but ordinary people, thousands of them, lining the pathway from the landing pad to the grand spire. Valori of every age and station, standing in silence as he walked past them. And as he passed each one, they touched their antennae to his hand, in a gesture that Korath later explained was the most intimate expression of gratitude in Valori culture, reserved only for those who had saved the life of someone beloved. It took him an hour to walk the path, and by the end of it, his hand was trembling, and his eyes were wet, and he could not speak. Teshai met him at the entrance to the great library and led him inside, through corridors filled with 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge and beauty, the music of dead civilizations preserved in crystal matrices, the philosophies of species that had gone extinct before humanity had learned to make fire, artwork and literature and scientific discoveries from every corner of the galaxy, gathered and protected by a people who believed that every story mattered. "This is what you saved," Teshai said quietly. Marin looked at the endless shelves and the soft light and the Valori archivists moving carefully among the collections, and he thought of his daughter, who had loved books and who had died on a world that no one had come to save. It was worth it, he said, and he meant it with every broken piece of his heart. Teshai led him to a chamber deep in the library where a single wall was carved with names in the flowing script of the Valori language, thousands of names stretching from floor to ceiling, and she told him, "Archive of Guardians, a record of every individual who had ever risked their life to protect the Valori people or their library." Every name on the wall was Valori. Until now. Teshai pressed her forelimb to the wall, and a new name appeared at the bottom, carved in both Valori script and human letters, Jonah Marin. He stared at it for a long time. Then he thanked her, and he left. He never spoke about it publicly, and he never needed to, because some things do not need to be spoken to be understood. Captain Lena Osei was promoted to Commodore and given command of the 1st Joint Rapid Response Fleet, a permanent multinational force composed of human and Rathani and Silfari and Orvani ships, stationed at strategic points across the galaxy with a single standing order. No distress call goes unanswered. She spent the first month drilling her crews into a cohesive fighting force. She spent the second month arguing with bureaucrats about funding. And she spent the third month doing what she did best, which was leading from the front, when the first real test came. Soran Keth sought Marin out before the Admiral left Shale Prime, and the two of them sat together in a small room overlooking the Valori capital, and shared a bottle of something strong that the Rathani called firewater, and that tasted like regret mixed with hope. "I have commanded fleets for 40 years, Keth said, and his deep voice was slower than usual. "I have won battles that are studied in our academies, and I have never been ashamed of a single order I have given, until the day I watched your ships fly into a fight that should have been ours." Marin poured him another drink and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. "We had the ships," Keth continued. "We had the firepower and the training and the strategic position to intervene from the very beginning. We simply lacked what your species seems to carry in abundance: the willingness to bleed for strangers." Marin considered this for a long time, and then he raised his glass. "You came in the end, because you showed us it was possible." They drank together until the stars came out over Shale Prime, and then they parted ways, and Keth returned to his fleet, and Marin returned to Earth, and neither of them ever forgot that evening. The story could have ended there, with treaties signed and heroes honored, and a galaxy changed forever by the actions of one species that refused to look away. But it did not end there, because stories never really end. They just find new places to begin. 7 weeks after the signing of the Shale Compact, a distress signal arrived from the far rim of the galaxy, a species called the Davari, whose name most of the Concord had never even heard. A small and quiet people who had colonized a handful of worlds in a region so remote that no one had bothered to notice them, until the Vraxith remnants came looking for easy prey. The signal was desperate and frightened, and it said the same thing that Teshai's signal had said 3 months earlier. "Please help us. We cannot fight. Someone please come." This time, the response was different. Within 1 hour of the signal being received, 14 species mobilized their forces. Human destroyers and Rathani cruisers and Silfari carriers and Orvani battleships and ships from a dozen other worlds that had signed the Shale Compact and meant it, formed up at rally points across the galaxy and jumped to slipspace in a coordinated wave that covered more distance and involved more species than any military operation in galactic history. Commodore Osei led the vanguard, and when her fleet dropped out of slipspace above the Davari homeworld, and the terrified aliens saw the impossible wall of ships that had come to save them, the message she broadcast was simple. "This is Commodore Lena Osei of the Joint Rapid Response Fleet. You called for help, and we are here. Nobody fights alone anymore." The galaxy had always known that humans were dangerous. They were loud and emotional and short-lived and stubborn, and they burned through their brief existence with an intensity that the elder species found exhausting and alarming in equal measure. But after Shale Prime, the galaxy understood something it had missed for a very long time. Humans were not dangerous because they loved violence. They were dangerous because they loved people. Even people they had never met. Even people who had never loved them back. Even people who lived on the far side of the galaxy and spoke languages they could not understand, and looked nothing like them, and had nothing to offer them in return. They came anyway. They always came. And that was the most terrifying and the most beautiful thing the universe had ever seen.